live session on economics of Egypt, the discussion series. Our talk today is about crucial challenges for the Egyptian economy, COVID-19 and after. And we are actually delighted and honored to host Dr. Khalid Ikram. Dr. Khalid Ikram is the one who's going to talk today or give the presentation today. And of course, as you all know, Dr. Khalid Ikram is a prominent Harvard and Cambridge trained economist. He's the former director at the World Bank and is the executive director at Ikram Consulting. He worked in Egypt with the World Bank for more than 25 years. And of course, he's an expert in the political economy of Egypt and the author of many books and monographs on political economy and economic policy. With respect to Egypt, at least he has 3 books: The Political Economy of Reforms in Egypt, Issues in Policy Making since 1952, The Egyptian Economy in 1952 to 2000, Performance Policies and Issues, Egypt Economic Management in a Period of Transition, and as Professor Ikram was just saying, is in the phase of writing another book about Egypt. Dr. Ikram has numerous consultancies with multilateral institutions, aid agencies, consulting institutions, governments at the national and the subnational levels. And he has been awarded the President of Korea's Gold Medal for services to Korean economic development. So we're really, really happy to have Dr. Ikram with us. Dr. Ikram is going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll open the floor for questions from Microsoft Teams and as well as Facebook, because this is a live session. I would like to ask you all before we start to mute yourselves, and if you're not talking, so please do not use the video or camera. After Dr. Ikram, Maha will take over. She'll take the questions, she'll relate them to Dr. Ikram, and I leave you now to enjoy this session. Professor Ikram, back to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, all right. Let me first thank you, all of you, for giving up your time to listen to me. I do hope that you won't consider this time wasted. I'd particularly like to thank Professor Maha El-Hini and the Economics Department of the British University for inviting me. And I would also like to thank Professor Ahmed Jamal for so patiently instructing me how to use the Microsoft Teams program. I must say that Maha must have a great deal of forbearance, because she also invited me when I was in Egypt last year to give a talk. And I was particularly delighted because it enabled me to meet some of the younger Egyptian economists and also gave me an opportunity to visit your campus in Cairo. Now, I'd like to structure my talk into 2 parts. In the first, I would deal with some of the issues connected with the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the second, I'd like to sketch out some things that Egypt's policymakers might want to take into account when they are devising economic policies for the medium term. Okay, now on to the pandemic. We are meeting today in very extraordinary times. The COVID-19 pandemic has overturned many aspects of our lives. Its final impact on our life in the economy will not be known for some time, perhaps for some considerable time. Under these circumstances, what we are going to speak about today will necessarily sound a little tentative. We should make no apology for this state of affairs, because to speak today about such matters, pretending that we know certainly, would not only be arrogance, but it would also be very wrong. So let me first begin with a frank statement of some of our principal areas of ignorance. I will start by reminding you of a number of don't knows. We don't know whether the number of persons infected by the virus is actually larger than that reported, because testing for the virus in Egypt is much more limited than in developed countries. Even in the developed countries, the number of persons who are infected but are asymptomatic, that is, they don't show any symptoms of the disease, is not known. Only last week, the head of the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said that the number of Americans who are actually infected could be 10 times the reported number. We do not know how long the virus will persist. We do not know whether there will be a second wave of the virus. In fact, some American states that had eased their lockdowns had to hastily reimpose these constraints because the infection rate began to spike after the easing. We do not know whether persons who have been infected and recovered have acquired some degree of immunity. We do not know whether or when it will be possible to develop a vaccination that will be effective, safe, affordable, and produced in the huge numbers required to immunize most of the world's population. We do not know whether and how the virus will mutate, so that it might require an annual vaccination, as happens, for example, with the influenza virus. Now, this may sound like a depressingly large number of don't knows, but I'm afraid that it reflects the reality of the times, and we have to be honest and adult and face up to these issues. What we do know is that the pandemic has played havoc with trade and transport, massively disrupted production cycles, hiked up unemployment, wiped out incomes, depressed government revenues, and accelerated a flight of capital to safer havens. These matters have affected different countries in different measure. The question is, what do they mean for Egypt? Let me now spend a few minutes on talking about effects on the Egyptian economy. The principal impact on Egypt's economy is likely to be on workers' remittances, on tourism, on Suez Canal revenues, and on the impact on oil and commodity prices. Let's take a very quick look at some of these. Let's first talk about worker remittances. In 2019, expatriate Egyptian workers remitted $26.8 billion to Egypt, and this accounted for something like 10% of the country's GDP. Now, tourism in 2018 accounted for $13 billion, which was a bit more than 5% of Egypt's GDP. Suez Canal revenues amounted to about $6 billion, which was about 3% of Egypt's GDP. So just looking at these three sectors, it appears that about 20% of Egypt's GDP is likely to be affected. Moreover, the figures that I've quoted represent only the direct amount of the sectors affected. We also know that the reductions will have multiplier effects, in that persons whose incomes have been reduced are likely to reduce their expenditures, and this will reduce incomes further down the line. Because let's remember that in a modern economy, one person's expenditure is another person's income. And when person A reduces his expenditure, it reduces person B's income, who will reduce his expenditure, which will reduce person C's income, and so on. But as economists, you are aware of all these things. I just wanted to remind you of those. In addition to the foregoing, one has to consider that oil prices went down sharply, while commodity prices increased. To the extent that Egypt is an oil exporter, its foreign exchange revenues were hit. Moreover, as incomes fell virtually throughout the world, it would not be surprising to see the demand for other Egyptian exports also affected. The rise in some of commodities, the prices of some of commodities, would also hit Egypt. Because remember that up to 60% of Egypt's wheat is imported, as is perhaps 30 to 40% of its meat. And there are other numbers of intermediate products that Egypt imports also. The problem essentially that the pandemic has caused, and why it is in a sense unlike that of other crises, is that the pandemic has hit both the demand side and the supply side of the economy at the same time. The demand side has been hit because incomes are being reduced. The supply side has been hit because workers and other people have been infected and so can no longer work, or for reasons of safety have been asked not to work. This is a double whammy that the world had not really seen before. And that is why dealing with it is more difficult. And that is why all of us are somewhat in the dark about how to manage this. And that is why I began with a number of don't knows, so that I'm being upfront with all of you that why this pandemic is unlike that of, let's say, the financial crisis that hit before, or a tsunami that hit sometime, or an earthquake or something like that. This is different. It affects both the demand and the supply sides at the same time. And therefore, it requires a mix of policies that help both sides, that compensate on both sides. What should Egypt do in the circumstances? In the short run, I think the government has acted rapidly and in the appropriate direction. Through a number of initiatives, it has tried to keep up incomes and to keep up aggregate demand. The authorities have an unenviable task. They have to moderate the impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable elements of society. And recall that the most vulnerable elements of society, that group is increasing. The poverty rate, even before the pandemic, had increased from 27.8% in 2015 to 32.5% in 2018. So while the most vulnerable group is increasing, the government's revenues are being compressed because people's incomes are going down and factories and other places, other productive facilities are not working. What would help the government navigate this crisis? If the experience of other countries is any guide, the most important thing that the government can do in the circumstances is to show that its policies cause the burden of austerity and pain to be borne equally by all sectors of society. The literature and what one learns from the experience of countries that have successfully traversed a large degree of austerity, it emphasizes that people will put up with quite a lot of hardship if they feel that all classes of society are carrying a proportionate burden. This is what confers legitimacy to the government's policies and enables it to implement policies that are not easy to bear. People will only bear them if they see that they are fair. I think the government is doing its best. The Egyptian government is doing its best to see that this happens. But it's a question not only of implementing such policies, it's a question also of seeing that the message is understood and widely disseminated. Moving on from there, moving forward a little bit towards the medium term, one should pay attention to a saying that, quote, a crisis is too valuable to waste, unquote. What this means is that a severe crisis can overturn people's preconceptions and make them more amenable to major changes. They can take advantage of the greater willingness of people to consider new approaches because people consider that the crisis may in considerable part have been caused or made worse by the policies that were previously in existence. The government would now be able to push through reforms that would lead to greater flexibility and efficiency in the economy. What I'm saying is that we are stuck in a very difficult situation. We can either sit and weep and say, Ya Allah, what are we? Why have you done this to us? Boo hoo, boo hoo. Or one can say, okay, we are now in this crisis. How do we make the best of it? And how can we use it to some degree, to a large degree, to our advantage down the road? I've given several examples of reform following crises in my book. For example, the 1952 political crisis and the military crisis in Palestine led to the 1952 revolution, which again overturned the previous policy package. In 1956, the invasion by France, Britain, and Israel enabled another set of policies to be followed after that, the beginnings of nationalization and the change in the role of the government in the Egyptian economy. In 1961, the breakup of the union between Syria and Egypt led to another change in policies. Again, more public sector intervention and more distribution policies. In 1967, after the Suez Canal War, we had another acceleration of policies. I don't want to labor that point because I think we've already gone into them in the book and in other literature. But the government can take advantage of the present weaknesses in the economy, consider that the pandemic is making them worse, and go in for policies that would change them. I mean, what else should Egypt do? I think policymakers should consider 4 elements of a strategy. One, the country must maintain a minimum stock of essential commodities. These would be food and energy items and some other items that the government would consider essential, or the government and society consider essential. This is so that I'll talk a bit more about this down the road, but this is when a pandemic or a tsunami or an earthquake or a war or civil disobedience or whatever hits, the government has some stocks to fall back on while it reassesses the situation and is able to do something. My second point is, and this is something that a number of economists are increasingly pointing out, the shortages caused by the pandemic should not panic the authorities into seeing that you must have a formula for trying to produce everything at home. This applies to all countries, but it applies with special strength to Egypt. Why? A, because the country cannot produce everything at home. Remember, Egypt is an overcrowded oasis in the middle of a desert and is already running short of water. It cannot produce all the food itself that it needs without giving up the production of many other commodities that it could export and earn foreign exchange for essentials. If you grow more wheat, let's say, you have to give up the production of other items such as cotton. Egypt is a lousy producer of wheat compared to Argentina, the United States, Australia, and Canada, and France, and so on, essentially because their wheat is grown on rain-fed land. It's much cheaper to grow. Egypt would have to grow its wheat on irrigated land, which is much more expensive. So, and because the land, cultivable land in Egypt is restricted by the amount of water, if one grows more wheat, then you grow less of something else. If you end up by growing less cotton, you give up a crop on which Egypt is fantastically efficient. And in fact, no one can grow cotton of the quality that Egypt produces. And so Egypt would be giving that up. Egypt would be giving up a large amount of export earnings that way, export earnings that it could earn efficiently for the sake of import substituting wheat, which it grows quite inefficiently. I'm just offering that as an example that there are difficult trade-offs that the authorities will have to consider, and they would have to consider them quite carefully. B, by trying to produce a large number of items at the same time, Egypt would lose economies of scale in all of them, and then would only be able to produce all of them at much higher than international prices. C, concentrating the production of these essentials in one location, that is in one country, would be like putting all one's eggs in one basket. Such a strategy could make the country, in fact, very vulnerable. A single location can be hit by many potential dangers: drought, earthquake, war, civil unrest, or whatever. And Egypt has suffered from all of these, including flood and earthquake. Remember 1992. So my suggestion would be keep a minimum stock of the most essential commodities, but keep building up foreign exchange reserves to deal with other crises that would be coming. And I'll talk a little more about this down the road. The third thing that policymakers should have to consider is something that I've already mentioned, that build up your foreign exchange reserves to deal with potential crises. I mean, many years ago, Professor Richards commented that food security for Egypt means foreign exchange security. And this applies to other commodities as well. Excuse me while I switch off my phone. My wife has opened that. Oh, she hasn't. Okay. The fourth point is that Egypt must use this present crisis as an opportunity to re-examine its entire range of policies to see which of them do not make sense in the new environment created by the pandemic. Let me give an example. The binding constraint on Egypt's agriculture is water, not land. And yet, the binding constraint on Egypt's agriculture is water, not land. And the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has pointed out repeatedly that a significant amount of Egypt's land is planted to sugarcane and rice, both of which are very water-intensive crops, and of which Egypt is not a very efficient producer. The FAO has also pointed out that sugarcane is a year-round crop. So planting it means that Egypt deprives itself of a second crop. And in many areas, it displaces cotton, of which Egypt is a very efficient producer, and as I said earlier, an item that is in very great demand internationally. Again, I mean, this was just an example, but what I'm saying is that this is the time for Egypt's authorities to re-examine their entire package of policies and incentives and see what makes sense in this new environment, a new international environment, and what policies are actually working against their own goals. I don't know what goals the Egyptian policymakers have set themselves, but if they ask me, I would say that you have two principal goals that any government, and especially now talking in the context of Egypt, has two principal goals. It is responsible, Egypt's policymakers is responsible, A, for ensuring a better life for its citizens, and B, for reducing the country's vulnerability to external pressures. And I mentioned the second one because Egypt's history is replete with it being taken over by foreign governments. I mean, you just have to go back even to the 1880s and the Caisse de la Dette Publique, in which Britain and France absolutely just effectively took over Egypt. So I would just put these two goals, the assurance of a better life for its citizens and the reduction of the country's vulnerability to external pressures, as the two key goals, the two essential goals that Egypt's government has to aim at. And now one can make these two goals operational rather than, just some airy-fairy statement. The first goal would be made operational by measures to increase Egypt's GDP. The second goal would be made operational by reducing Egypt's deficit on the current account of the balance of payments. We can talk at length about how one would do each of these things, and I've discussed a number of these in my book and in the previous book also, and we can have another session going into more detail on these issues. But for the moment, let me just say that these are the two goals that I would see that are absolutely necessary for Egypt's policymakers to attain. And so Egypt's policymakers should examine the entire range, the entire policy framework, and see which elements of that framework further these two aims and which elements, in fact, run counter to these two aims and get rid of these of the latter. Okay. Now, let me conclude this part of my talk with just one more remark, which I think in the present circumstances is especially important. This remark is the following. Policymakers know that there are known knowns with which they have to deal. For example, they know how much foreign exchange will be required to meet external debt servicing next year, and they know that this is the amount that they have to put aside for it. Then they also have to deal with known unknowns, that is, risks that they are aware of, but they don't know how big these are, and therefore they don't know what effect they will have. Let me give you an example. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization might predict that next year is the point in the reproduction cycle of locusts when a swarm will descend on Egypt. Okay, so the country makers know that a swarm of locusts is coming and it will affect the country's agricultural output. But they don't know how large the swarm will be, so they don't know how much damage it will cause to Egyptian agriculture, and so they don't know how many resources they will have to put aside to make good the losses. But now we are becoming increasingly aware that the most dangerous areas of ignorance might be the unknown unknowns. These are the factors that we don't know that we don't know. These are the lurking dangers that we don't even know exist. The COVID-19 pandemic provides an excellent example. No one knew that such a virus existed or that it could be transmitted from animals to humans. The result is that the whole world was totally unprepared, and now policymakers are scrambling desperately to find answers that would deal with it. The point I want to make is that other unknown unknowns are quite likely to come again out of the blue and hit Egypt. By definition, the policymakers don't know what these things will be, when they will strike, how long they will last, and what damage they will inflict. But the country has to be ready to respond when the crisis hits. This means, once again, that Egypt must build up its stock of human capital and its foreign exchange reserves so that it is able to purchase from the international market what it needs, and that it has within the country the necessary reservoir of skills to effectively use all the resources. Okay, let me say that is the end of part A that I was talking about. Now I'll move on to part B, which is what are the critical issues that Egypt's economic policy makers should consider once the immediate concerns of the COVID-19 pandemic have passed. I'm assuming that at some point we'll be able to overcome them or learn to live with them. In the time available to us, it is obvious that I cannot explore these issues in depth. I shall only be able to raise some points that policymakers should consider when drawing up a medium-term development strategy for Egypt. First, let me begin by saying something which might sound a little odd. I want to say that the principal difficulty impacting Egypt's economy is not economic. It is the difficulty of putting together a political coalition that would support a broad movement of reform, a broad movement of economic reform. It's a political economy question, not purely political and not purely economic. Now, what I've said is, of course, not primarily the job of an economist. She or he can only provide an analysis of the issues, indicate policies that would help resolve the problems, drawing, if needed, on the best practice of other countries. Let me hasten to add that I am quite aware that one cannot simply graft onto Egypt a policy that has been successful elsewhere. You simply can't take a policy that worked in South Korea or in Brazil or in Timbuktu and say, why doesn't Egypt do the same? One has to pay due regard to differences in institutions, in values, in implementation capabilities, and more. But what such examples of success in other countries can do is to at least start one's thinking. And this is the contribution that economists can make to my first point, that of helping to create a political economy consensus for reform. The second point I want to make is that policymakers must recognize, they must absolutely recognize that rapid economic growth for Egypt is not a luxury or something that is nice if it happens. It's an absolute necessity. Egypt's demographic dynamics permit no alternative. As I said in my book, every 2 years, Egypt adds a New Zealand or an Ireland to its population. Every 3, a Denmark or a Finland. Every 4, an Israel or a Switzerland. And every 5, a Sweden or a Portugal. But while it adds the population, it does not add the capital assets, the technical knowledge, the institutions, and the governance of these countries. So I want to emphasize how urgent the problem of economic growth is and why it must be front and center. That's my third point, that economic development should be front and center in a country's overall strategy. This is borne out by the experience of the fast-growing countries of East Asia, such as China, South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and so on. These countries have explicitly recognized that in the modern world, the well-being and indeed the very independence of the country depended on its ability to stand on its own feet economically. Therefore, they subordinated almost all their other goals to the economic goals. In fact, a Korean deputy prime minister who was responsible for the economy once told me that without economic independence, political independence was an illusion. It just didn't exist. Because if you were weak economically, another country could manipulate you quite easily. He said that therefore, until Korea achieved a large measure of economic independence, it would make whatever compromises were necessary to achieve that goal. It would say, ha, there, yeah, rice, to, to all other policies and to its main providers of finance, technology, and so on, until Korea achieved economic independence. He was quite explicit that even an independent foreign policy was an unaffordable luxury, and Korea would simply side with the United States, which was its main source of security, finance, and technology. But once economic independence had been achieved, or achieved to a large measure, then that gave the country much more freedom of maneuver. It gave the country much more leeway to pursue an independent foreign policy. Let's compare Egypt's history with Korea's attitude. Since the end of the Korean War, South Korea has not engaged in a hot war with North Korea, meaning a shooting war with North Korea, despite the provocations of the latter, which included an attack on the South Korean president's residence. On the other hand, Egypt sought to assume the role of leader of the Arab world, leader of Africa, leader of Muslims, a major player among the non-aligned group, a supporter of the Algerian resistance to the French and of the Palestinians. It's been involved in wars with Israel in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, plus the war of attrition in 1969. It was also involved in a war against Saudi Arab proxies in Yemen from 1962 to 1967. Now, let me be clear. I'm not at all saying that Egypt should not have done these things. A country has the right to pursue any policy that it deems to be in its interest or to which it feels a moral commitment. Egypt had a perfect right to engage in the conflicts I have mentioned. One might also note that a number of these conflicts were in fact imposed on Egypt. The point I want to make is that decisions and actions have consequences. You can do whatever you like, but you must be prepared to accept that these things will have consequences, some of which will be harmful consequences. The frequent hostilities and continuing tensions drained Egypt's financial and human capital and also put it at odds with the world's principal providers of finance, technology, and research. And we have seen South Korea went out of its way to avoid being sucked into such a position. The fourth point that Egypt's policymakers should consider is that the country's economic policies should be seen to be backed by the highest levels of government. It's not just enough to have a minister every now and then say we want to do X and Y. The president should throw his weight behind those economic policies. Let me once again give you the example of South Korea. From about 1961 until the late 1970s, the president of the country chaired a monthly meeting of the leading exporters. At that meeting, export targets were assigned, difficulties faced by exporters were resolved, and performance was monitored. Successful exporters were able to access bank credit at an average rate of 4% a year, when the free market rate was 30% and more. Successful exporters were also given preferential access to foreign exchange, to acquiring land for their factories, to permission for hiring international exports, and tax concessions. On the other hand, exporters who regularly fell short of their targets were refused bank credit on orders from the government. These firms were rendered unable to pay their taxes, their utility bills, their workers' wages, and so on. They could only avoid going to jail or incurring similar punishment by selling a part of their conglomerate, by selling a part of their enterprises. This measure was so drastic, this measure was carried out and was so drastic that a president of Daewoo Heavy Industry told me, Mr. Ikram, in order to avoid this fate, we would be willing to export our grandmothers. I hope he didn't mean this literally, but that was the feeling. This policy carried on for quite some time. I once told a deputy prime minister of Korea that Dr. Kim, I'm sick of hearing about the Korean miracle, the Korean economic miracle. I want to hear about Korean failures. So he said, what do you mean by a Korean failure? I said, I want to go meet a businessman who suffered at the hands of government and who's ready to curse it. So he laughed. He said, there are not many of them, but I will set up such a meeting for you. A couple of days later, he telephoned me and said, Dr. Ikram, are you free for dinner tomorrow? And I said, well, it depends on who I'm meeting for dinner. So he said, I've arranged a meeting for you with the president of Cookjay. And I said, and what does Cookjay do? And he said, it's the 8th biggest conglomerate. And the president of that is being hurt by the Korean government's policies, and he's ready to talk to you. So I went along. And this poor man was almost weeping. He said that he had run foul of the government's export and other policies. And as a result, bank credit had been denied to him. And he had been forced to sell off his shoemaking factory, his shoemaking company, for a pittance. I mean, because he could only sell it to a successful exporter, and the successful exporter, being the sole purchaser, could name whatever price he wanted. And he said the price of shoes in the international market is now so high that the profits of my shoemaking company could have subsidized all the rest of the companies that I own. But of course, now I no longer own the shoemaking company. I've been forced to sell it. So, as I said, the rewards and the punishments were quite huge, and they were enforced. They were carried out. This leads me to my 6th point. The authorities must recognize, sorry, it leads to my 5th point, that the government must carry out policies that it has announced. It must establish its credibility. And the paradox is that once its credibility for carrying out hard policies is established, it then doesn't have to carry out punishments or something, because people fall into line more easily to begin with. They automatically do what the government wants them to do. A Harvard-sponsored study showed that only about 20% of Korean businessmen believed that policy announced by the first Korean government under Syngman Rhee were implemented. Only about 20% of them were implemented, of the announced policies were implemented. Whereas 95% of those announced by the government of Park Chung-hee, who started the Korean miracle, were, quote, always implemented, and that it was impossible to avoid complying, full stop, close quote. This credibility actually enabled President Park to avoid having to take extreme measures. To put it bluntly, once he had inflicted punishments on half a dozen businessmen where he said he would inflict punishment, there was no need to do this to others, because the others began to do what he wanted. As an example of what he did to begin with, he got hold of a number of businessmen whom he considered to have been corrupt and to have defrauded the country. And he made them march around the streets of Seoul carrying signs saying, I am a corrupt swine, or I drink the blood of the working man, or I have exploited the poor. So once this had been seen that, the biggest businessman in the land were being made to do this kind of thing. The other businessmen soon realized that it was better for them to do what the government did, make their profits, but make their profits in line with social priorities. And social priorities for Korea meant exports. If you permit me, I'll take 1 minute and explain why exports were so keen to Korea. What happened was that the Korean government, they had a coup in 1961, and that is when President Park Chung-hee took over. He was a military general. And to begin with, he followed the traditional policies of his predecessors, which was crony capitalism and import substitution industrialization. But then, fortunately, he came under the influence of a group of economists who gave him the following reasoning. They said, Mr. Park, or President Park, your principal responsibility is to the security of Korea. And this security means defense against North Korea and possibly a North Korea supported by China. Now, at the moment, we are supported by the Americans, but you cannot rely on the Americans. They have already begun to pull out some of their troops, and they are muttering about removing more of them. So we have to stand on our own feet militarily. But modern militaries are not two groups of people fighting each other with sticks and stones. They require technology, and Korea does not have the technology. So we have to purchase it. But to purchase it, we require foreign exchange, and we require it to be borrowed because we don't have it at present, and we will have to repay it in foreign exchange. And the only way we can repay it is by earning foreign exchange, i.e. by exports. So they closed the circle by saying that, Mr. President, if you want to be responsible for Korea's security, Korea has to export. Now, President Park, fortunately, took the advice of his economic advisors, and he then went around making speeches saying, Korea must export to live, and exports above all, and so on and so on. And this is why he began chairing monthly meetings of Korean exporters and subsidizing and rewarding the successful and penalizing the unsuccessful. Anyway, if we have more time, some other time, we can talk about Korea's experience in some detail and see what it took to bring a country that's per capita income in 1960 was about 60% of that of Egypt, and whose exports consisted of largely of human hair wigs and soft toys, and amounted to only about $300 million. And in one generation, its per capita income is $20,000, and its exports are $600 billion. And it's, as I said, the distinguishing factor is that Korea has no natural resources. Its growth is policy driven. And while getting to that rapid economic growth, Korea has one of the most, or had one of the most equitable distributions of income. It followed an inclusive economic development policy, which delivered rapid economic growth as well as a much better distribution of income than other countries have been able to achieve. I keep harping on Korea, A, because, I mean, it had no natural resources, it has no natural resources, and its growth is policy driven. And also because I was fortunate to work for 10 years running the World Bank's economic dialogue and programs with Korea. And I must have done something right, because they ended up giving me the President's Gold Medal for services to Korean development. Anyway, that's a sideline. We can discuss that some other time. Let me come back to another point that Egypt's policymakers must consider if they are to have a successful medium-term development policy after the pandemic. And this is, they must recognize that the initial stages of reform are likely to involve a degree of austerity. There is no magic bullet, there is no magic formula that would resolve all of Egypt's economic difficulties and not cause some hardship. One of my teachers at Cambridge University described the search for such a formula as, quote, a blind man looking at night in a dark room for a black cat which wasn't even there, full stop, close quote. Please don't waste time looking for such a formula. It doesn't exist. There will be austerity, there will be pain. The country will bear it if A, it is shown that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and B, that the pain is being borne by everybody, that all Egyptians are contributing to the development of their country. And it's not that a small class is benefiting and a large number of people are suffering. That is my seventh point, in fact. I mean, that reforms, the pain that reforms will initially bring must be seen to be equitably shared by society. I've said enough about this. I don't want to harp on this. Let me go to my eighth point for policymakers, and that is that Egypt's continued and sustained development will increasingly depend on how it deals with the software of growth. By software of growth, I mean the incentive system and the institutions that underpin the economy. The hardware is obviously the infrastructure, the factories, and the agricultural land and other productive facilities. Decisions concerning the hardware are generally straightforward. It's clear that power stations and roads have to be built, machinery has to be imported and set up, canals and drainage facilities and channels have to be constructed, and so forth. But the software of growth is a more complex and difficult matter. Let me give you one or two examples to illustrate what I mean and what needs to be done. In recent times, it has become clear that the smooth working of the economy is impossible without the efficient working of a number of institutions. The very concept of a free, private sector-led market economy is based on the premise of enforceable property rights and commercial contracts. And in general, that enforceability is guaranteed by the possibility of rapid, impartial, and efficient litigation through the courts. This means that the judicial system, and especially the commercial judicial system and its workings, are crucial for an economy. Now, unfortunately, it appears that Egyptian commercial judicial procedures are seen to be slow and to be expensive. A large-scale study by USAID found that the average commercial dispute in Egypt took about 7 years to resolve, and the court costs amounted to about 7.5% of the final settlement. These costs are so high because Egypt uses the commercial judicial system to subsidize the criminal judicial system. Moreover, more than 80% of the judicial systems arrived at after this average of 6 or 7 years were appealed, and this consumed another 2 to 4 years in the Court of Cassation. Then implementing the decisions took another 2 to 4 years. You can see that when these decisions take on average from start to implementation perhaps 15 years, it discourages the normal channels of investment, and it discourages even more the normal channels of foreign investment, because a domestic investor is more familiar with what it takes to get things done. A foreign investor doesn't know how the system here works. So my point is that Egypt's policymakers should recognize the importance of the smooth functioning of the commercial judicial system and take into account the views of Egyptian judges, Egyptian businessmen, as well as foreign businessmen and other stakeholders to see what could be done to improve the situation. Because without the efficient functioning of the commercial judicial system, the economy and the entire society are going to be working at a suboptimal level. Similarly, the efficient functioning of the bureaucracy is also key. For much of the period since 1952, the Egyptian government employed almost 1/3 of the labor force, and this figure does not include the armed forces or the public enterprises. This ratio has shrunk somewhat, but even in 2018, the government still employed about 25% of the labor force. There was one government employee for every 13 Egyptian citizens. Now, this has a number of effects. It creates a lot of make work because, I mean, these people have to justify their existence. It has a tremendous impact on the budget, and the government is unable to provide a reasonable pay to most of the bureaucracy. Not getting enough pay discourages the brightest and the best qualified Egyptians from applying to join the government service. And it also has an incentive, it also has an impact on the bureaucrats' incentive to work. The result, and I know this from many of my Egyptian friends, that many of them work at second jobs, even during hours when they should be in their government offices. Now, these matters of pay and incentive and so on are not unique to Egypt. I mean, these problems resonate in other countries too. Some of you may recall the words of the leader of the Polish Steelworkers Trade Union. He said, they, meaning the government, pretends to pay us and we pretend to work. Let me draw your attention to how Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, who was Prime Minister from 1959 to 1990, and he was the creator of the Singapore economic miracle, retorted when someone said to him that the Singapore civil service was paid too much. Mr. Lee said, quote, "If you pay peanuts, you will get only monkeys to work for you." Full stop, close quote. As a result, the Singapore civil service is not paid peanuts. It is one of the best paid and one of the most efficient civil services in the world. There are other institutions that are important, such as the taxation system, the education system, the health system, and so on. However, I feel that I have tried your patience long enough, and I will stop right here and take whatever questions you have. Thank you once again for your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor Ikram. We already have the tasks and the burdens on our shoulders really heavily. This has been very extensive. Thank you very much for the very deep insight. And now we are ready to have the questions. I would like to first go back to Dr. Rania Mnisi and see if she has to start off with the question, please.
I will give the floor to the attendees first, and I'll ask my question last, Maha. Thank you so much.
Okay, Dr. Rania, I'll just want to start with a little brief highlight of what Professor Ikram had given us today, which is very, very difficult to digest at the moment until our attendees prepare their questions. Professor Ikram has given us the speech on two levels very deeply. He started off with the certainties and uncertainties about the economy. Now, the certainties of the COVID-19 shock, the uncertainties of the infections, the vaccines and the mutations of this COVID-19 pandemic in Egypt and all over the world. What we do know, however, that these infections and this pandemic had disrupted the Egyptian economy, well, the world trade, unemployment, government revenues, capital flights, investments, to say the least. What they mean for Egypt are very negative: workers' remittances, negative impact on tourism, Suez Canal, oil and commodities prices, trade prices, and demand and supply shocks. The mix of policies that compensates both sides need to be addressed on both the demand and supply shocks. Now, very quickly, I'm going to move to how the government can help in the short run. Now, show policies that are inclusive of all the classes in the society and the economy, reflect sound policies that are fair and widely disseminated, medium term, a crisis that is too valuable to waste, learn from what the problems that this crisis had put in front of us and be able to address them very deeply, very quickly in the short and the medium run. Professor Ikram had also told us about the changes and the weaknesses in the economy in 4 elements to maintain a minimum shock of the essential commodities. They should not panic the economy and try to produce everything inside Egypt. Give the production of wheat a lesser priority and perhaps move to cotton in the short run. Build up the foreign exchange reserves. Ensure a better operational system of the government, reducing vulnerability to external pressures and shocks. Now, this is a very important point. Let me highlight that I would like to add the water shocks and the terrorism shocks, debt servicing challenges, risks of the unknowns in the agricultural sector. Moving to policymakers, Professor Ikram had highlighted the difficulty of putting a political coalition in a reform structure and a comparison, and a very, very deep comparison with Korea, putting Korea forward in the developmental structure. Austerity and pain are a must that must be felt in the Egyptian economy if the reform is to continue. Institutions and incentives are the software of the economy that need to be very deeply addressed. If I had missed anything, it's just for the time constraints, and I would like to start with the first question. So far, Professor Ikram, the position of the over-imposition of the COVID pandemic on the IMF already imposed reform, does this not give Egypt a better standing point, kickoff point, to deal with this demand and supply shock? Had we not been started the IMF structural reform program, both deeply and on the macroeconomic level, would the Egyptian economy be worse off, in your opinion?
I think, in my opinion, yes, it would have been worse off if it hadn't been implementing these reforms. I mean, as to the reforms themselves, they covered quite a wide range of things, and Egypt has been, very good at implementing most of them. But I discussed these reforms with my IMF colleagues, and I must say I had a number of reservations about them. And if I had been in Egypt, I would have discussed them with my Egyptian friends and colleagues and made the same point. That they are weak on some important structural matters. I mean, I think this is a particular weakness that the IMF generally tends to have, because the IMF, when their missions come, you'll have econometricians, you'll have monetary economists, you'll have fiscal economists, you'll have very good people dealing with those areas. But you won't have very good people dealing with what is called the real economy. I've never seen an agricultural economist on an IMF mission. I've never seen an industrial economist. I've never seen a health economist, an education economist, a social protection economist, and so on. So they tend to look at the monetary and foreign exchange side of the economy only. In fact, I mean, I used to joke with them and say that, look, why do you bother going to a country? I can tell you what your reforms will be. You're going to say, raise the interest rate, devalue the currency, and increase taxes and decrease government spending. So I said, you can just sit over here in Washington, make it known to all your members that item A will be devaluation, item B will be interest rate, item C will be the fiscal deficit, and item D will be, something else. And just send them a cable saying A minus 5%, B plus 3%, D minus 6%, E minus 14%. That's the end. You don't really have to go there. You just have to send them, don't waste that time. And they will understand exactly what this means. But so we got into an argument. I mean, this has happened frequently with me and the IMF. I mean, they kept getting into arguments. And I said, look, when you say, let's take devaluation, fine. Egypt needs to devalue because it needs some breathing space in which it makes its products cheaper on the international market. But it only gives it price competitiveness for a certain amount of time until the differential inflation between Egypt and its competitors begins to be felt.
Yes.
But in order to take advantage of the price competitiveness, you must have something that you are selling. You must have something that you're producing that the world wants to buy. Otherwise, you can be as price competitive as you like. Nobody wants to buy your damn thing that you're not producing. I mean, nobody can buy that. So why don't you? So you have to pay attention to the real economy to say, if I am saying that Egypt must be price competitive, it must also say what you must do to Egyptian industry, to Egyptian agriculture, to Egyptian whatever else, to increase in an effective manner the production of those items for which you are becoming price competitive. And the IMF is weak in that. And this is why, I mean, you produce the devaluation, you produce an immediate surge in exports by diverting from the home market to the export market what you're already producing. And then what do? You wait for these incentive effect to take effect, which, if you measure the time lags, will setting up a new factory for an exportable or diverting the production from something that is you can sell in the domestic market of a quality that you can sell in the domestic market, and improving its quality to sell it internationally, is going to take 2 years or so at a minimum.
Longer. We have take much longer than 2 years.
And longer. So these time lags and so on, which occur in the real economy, are never taken into account. One of my teachers at Cambridge used to joke about this. She used to say, Mrs. Joan Robinson, she used to say that the neoclassical economists, the pure neoclassical economists, seem to think that capital is stuff, it's ectoplasm, that one day it's producing, I don't know, a tractor, and the next day it's producing a car, and the day after that it's producing cotton textiles. I mean, so it doesn't happen. These are fixed investments which are dedicated to a particular product, and it has only a small range of flexibility. And therefore, you have to pay attention to time lags. Sorry.
So what do you think about involving Egypt in substitution of producing something fully in the global value chain? And this is perhaps the Ministry of Industry is trying to do, is produce parts of re-exportables, if you like, as a short, medium-term solution.
Okay, that's a very good question. And let me give you a practical answer to it. What did the East Asian miracle consist of? If you asked me, what does Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, what do they have in common? A very good answer would be zero natural resources and hundreds of billions of dollars of export. How do they do this? They do this by importing raw materials and semi-finished products, adding value to that by a technically trained labor force, and selling it at a competitive exchange rate. Yes. That's all. That is the essence of the East Asian miracle. This is what China is doing also at present. Yes. I mean, the import component of Korean exports used to be between 40 and 45%.
Yes.
I mean, but Egyptian policymakers, and not only Egyptian, Pakistani, Indian, other policymakers seem to be working on the assumption that a country can be competitive in its exports only these exports are based on materials that are indigenous to the exporting country. I mean, in Egypt, we produce raw cotton. Okay, we produce cotton textiles. We produce, petroleum. We make some petroleum products, and then that's it. I mean, this is why Egypt's products exports remain concentrated in a limited number of items, and they go to a limited number of markets. But what the Koreans, the Taiwanese, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Hong Kong, the Singapore, and so on have shown is that a very brilliant, dynamic export policy can be based on imported inputs. And so it's a philosophical change that the policymakers have to take.
Okay, this brings us to the wheat substitution. And don't you think that wheat is a strategic good, and it always been a strategic good for Egypt for as long as it existed? To convince the Egyptian economy and the policymakers to import the full amount of wheat is going to be a very difficult task. But now we have a waterfront problem. What do you think about this very, very pressing issue? Wheat on one side, water issues are strangling the current consumption and agriculture overall.
Well, you see, I mean, let me first begin by saying I'm not an agricultural economist, so you will have to consult somebody who's more expert in this. But even at present, Egypt has to import 60% of its wheat. Now, maybe Egypt can import 0% of its wheat, but you have to look at what the opportunity cost of that is.
Yes.
How much land under cotton, how much land under sugarcane, how much land under rice, how much land under fruits, how much land under vegetables, how much land under whatever else, land under pasture for animals, you'll have to give up.
Yes.
See, the binding constraint on Egypt is that that 98% of the population is living on 4% of the land area.
Yes.
And so the amount of cultivable land per person is decreasing. So the population growth
is going to decrease even further now with the water problem. Now,
of course,
this is going to strangle what the current government is trying to alleviate, which is trying to move out of this 4 to 5% and move out to other areas with no water. This is not going to happen, not even in the short run. So,
I know. I mean, a lot of this started with I don't know what it's called now and what its status is, but it was the Toshka project. I mean that it was to construct a canal taking off from Lake Nasser at a point called Toshka and linking up the other oases with it. And I don't know what the present status of that is, but that was an attempt again. That was again an attempt to increase the cultivable area.
Yes.
I know that Prince Talal of Saudi Arabia bought 100,000 acres over there, but I don't know how many other people bought it because it was the rest of. I mean, the area needed to be developed, and nobody wanted to go and live in temperatures of, I don't know, 45 degrees centigrade around the year.
Yes.
Professor Ikram, we have questions from the audience, so I'll ask them to ask the questions.
Yeah.
And then we'll collect the questions, and then perhaps you can answer them all together. So,
Fine.
Mariam, would you like to start? Mariam? Mariam, you raised your hand. Do you have a question? Okay, perhaps we should go to Yasmin Khodri. Yasmin, you raised your hand. Do you have a question? Yasmin? Okay.
Is my voice clear?
Yes, your voice is very clear. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I loved the session. Thank you so much, Professor Ikram. It's really mind for thought. The first one is with regards to the idea of having restructuring our focus in exports and in imports and our focus on products at the moment. And here I would like to
Yasmin, your voice is not very clear.
It's also around the world.
I'm sorry.
My voice is not clear.
No.
Okay, is it clear now?
Yes.
Okay, so at the very moment, we are in a very volatile situation, and this volatile situation is not touching Egypt alone, it's touching the whole countries in the world. And as much as interdependence and cooperation is very important, it's at the same time creating dependence on those countries. So, for example, if we're talking about wheat again and other important products, this is not only creating interdependence. If we left something like this for them, it's actually creating dependence. So here comes the theories of dependency and the development of underdevelopment. And therefore, I do think that we need to reconsider.
Your voice is gone, Yasmin.
Is it that about?
Yasmin, sorry, we can't hear you.
Or in focusing on them, is this really? Rania, you cannot hear me well?
Yeah, we heard the first part, but not the second part. Or am I
okay,
not hearing properly? Professor Ikram, can you hear?
I heard her up to reconsider, and then she disappeared.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I can try again.
What did you have to
Dr. Rania.
Yeah, what did you have to reconsider?
Yes, I'd like to reconsider the idea of.
Okay, Yasmin, perhaps you were
on particular products that have
Yasmin, perhaps it would be easier if you could write your question.
I try to work and use my mobile meanwhile.
Okay. Please write it down. We will go to Sama and then Mu'tamir, and then okay, Sama, do you have a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Please,
okay.
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, Professor Ikram, let me thank you for such presentation. In fact, it was very indulging and very comprehensive. My question is in relation to the point where you compared the case of Korea to Egypt, and you have greatly emphasized on the importance of the software tools for growth to attain a medium-term policies development. However, do you believe, in your opinion, that Egypt has to shift its emphasis from hardware tools, as we have seen it has invested greatly in the development of its infrastructural base, to initiate a new process of reform that would target its economic structure? Although focusing on different agent models, we have seen that they've been capable to succeed in their economic development because they are characterized with strong infrastructural base that Egypt has yet to achieve. So in your opinion, is this shift necessary to take place now, or shall the government focus more on building an infrastructure to accommodate for development policies in regards to the economy? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sama. And then Mu'tamir, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to have a question about Egyptian debt in specific and world debt in general. Do you see that the debt is actually getting into a very dangerous zone right now for Egypt and worldwide? This is number one. And number two, when it comes to like a general question, do you think that the small and medium enterprise for Egypt is way out of this constraints which we are facing right now in the economy? Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Ikram, I have one question. I think this is the last question, and then I will give you the floor to answer the questions, please. My question is actually about the austerity measures, because you at the beginning you said that the demand and the supply have both been affected because of the COVID-19. They have both decreased. So now with the austerity measures, wouldn't that compound the problem? I think now you can start answering the questions, if you please.
Shall I then? Okay, let me then have a go. All these three questions, I must say, were very good ones. They show considerable amount of thought on the part of those who asked, and I really appreciate their asking this. The first question dealt with moving towards the software of growth, while or whether the emphasis should continue for some time on infrastructure, which is also necessary. I really don't see this as an either or question, because the question that the lady asked is something that I've encountered in many other countries where I've been a consultant. And the reason I don't see this as an either or question is that the software, let's take an actual example. To me, what happens is that the software of improving the software of growth makes it more attractive economically to build up the hardware, and makes it more profitable to use the hardware, to create the hardware and to use it. Let me give you an example. If you look at the cost of doing business studies that the World Bank does almost every year in 140 countries or 130 countries? No, sorry, 180 countries. Egypt ranks somewhere around 131, 132, something like that, for ease of doing business. It's low down on almost all the things, on the ease of making a contract, on the enforceability of contracts, on how long it takes to get permission to build a storage facility, and so on and so on. Now, the point that I say is that if you improved the software of growth, which is you cut down on the bureaucratic delays of getting permission to build storage facilities, you improve the commercial working of the commercial judicial system, so that contracts didn't take 15 years to be honored, but I mean 1 or 2 years and so on, you would make the businesses and the work so much more profitable that you would be generating resources for the hardware of growth. I mean, if my investment in a firm, in a factory, can yield profits and higher profits within 2 years rather than in 7 or 8, I'm going to build another factory also. I am going to use my own resources to improve the hardware of growth. I will be generating more taxes for the government, with which it can build more public infrastructure. I will be doing things that make it easier for the government to run public-private partnerships for energy products, energy projects, for road projects, for even railway projects and other things. Improving the software of growth doesn't run counter to improving the hardware of growth. In fact, improving the software of growth makes it more profitable to increase the hardware of growth, and in fact also generates the profits, generates the resources with which to increase the hardware of growth. They are not either or things. I hope this is a more or less satisfactory answer to the question that was raised. The second question concerned the issue of debt, I think it was.
Yes.
And I think that I must confess I haven't looked at the latest figures of debt, but what I would urge the questioner to look at is two things. One is how much of the total debt is domestic debt and how much of it is external debt. You may find that a lot of the majority of the debt is domestic debt. Secondly, I would look at the terms of debt. And certainly after the two Iraq wars, the foreign lenders softened and wrote off a lot of the external debt. They softened the terms of their debt also. So I would think that the terms of the domestic debt are harder than those of the external debt. So a debt management policy would distinguish between these two types of debt and the burden that they are imposing on the economy. Thirdly, I would ask, why am I, the government, why am I contracting this debt? And I am contracting the external debt because I don't have a sensible export policy. My imports are regularly outrunning my exports. So, and this has happened not once, but over and over and over and over again. So I would sit down and say, how do I figure out a sensible export policy? And if you like, I can talk a bit about that also, but I leave the managing of time to you. Secondly, I would say that do I not have a sensible tax policy? And that's why my budget deficit outruns, it keeps on increasing. I mean, between 1965 and 2018, the budget deficit averaged 11% of GDP. That's a huge amount. I mean, anything over than 4% or so is considered dangerous. So what is the matter with my tax policy? If I say that I'm having growth of 5.6 or 5.7%, am I not generating profits for firms and income for individuals, which would enable me, the government, to collect more taxes? Or have I got so many loopholes in my tax structure and in my tax implementation mechanism that I'm just not able to collect these taxes? Because the domestic debt arises from a shortage of government revenues. The last question about the SMEs, I think, was particularly important. About 95% of Egypt's enterprises are small, micro, and medium enterprises. And yet, when one looks at the policy structure, the policies, these people, the small, medium, and micro enterprises, do not have access to the policymakers. They do not have access to the making of policy. Their voices are largely unheard. And the banks pay no attention to them, again, for a very simple reason. If the government is running a large deficit on its budget, it's safer, simpler, and more profitable for the bank to simply lend to the government. Why would it bother to lend to a small enterprise whose accounts are suspect and whose functioning, the bank is unaware of the real creditworthiness of it? And it will have to spend a lot of money to find out about the real creditworthiness of a small firm, and then it will only make a small loan to it. It's not profitable. This is a classic problem of what is known in the literature as asymmetric information, meaning that the borrower knows much more about the real state of his affairs than does the lender. So the lender ends up by not lending because it's too dangerous or too expensive, too dangerous to lend or too expensive for him to figure out how much he should lend. He just doesn't lend. So the amount of credit ends up by being suboptimal in the economy. And the suboptimality falls principally on the small and medium enterprises. They are the ones who suffer, although they account for 95% of Egypt's enterprises.
Okay, Professor Ikram, the question about austerity, please, and then we will have another round of questions, if you don't mind, if it's okay.
Sorry, what was the question about austerity?
Earlier we said that, you said that because of the COVID-19, we have, the demand has been reduced and so has the supply. But now if we apply the austerity measures, isn't this going to compound the problem?
Confound the austerity problem?
yeah, compound the decrease in the demand and the supply?
Well, you see, the supply problem is hitting countries differently.
Yeah.
For example, China has now pretty much reopened its economy because it considers that the pandemic is under control. That's a boost to supply. I'm sure that they'll have to close down parts of it again fairly soon, but it's a large enough economy to keep other parts of it working. There are other countries, New Zealand, for
Talking
instance.
about Egypt, right?
Well, you see, Egypt, I don't know how much testing Egypt is doing. The formula at present, until we get a vaccination, the formula for controlling the spread of the virus is 3 T's: testing, tracking, finding out who have been in contact with whom, and treatment. These are the 3 T's: testing, tracking, and treatment. Any country which has flattened the curve of rising infections or has made the curve go down has been following these. South Korea has done that. New Zealand has done this spectacularly. They are back to normal. My brother lives in New Zealand and he says life is back to normal because they have 0 new infections. But it was a very rigorous program of testing, tracking, and treatment. So obviously, countries like Egypt find this difficult. They don't have the resources and they don't have the infrastructure for it. But this is, until a vaccination is available that is effective and affordable, these 3 T's are the only things that will flatten the curve.
Okay. We have questions from Yasmin now. She's back, hopefully with a better connection. And then Mariam.
Okay.
Okay, so Yasmin, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much, Rania.
Reconsider what exactly?
Yes, the first thing is, well, as much as comparative advantage is very important and focusing on areas where we have specialization is important as well, but then we're not really living in normal situation. We're living in a crisis time, and we're not really living it alone. We're living it with other countries that are also witnessing the same crisis, and they are responding to the crisis in their own way. So interdependence and cooperation in this current moment also means dependency on those countries, i.e. we are dependent on them to provide us with products and with commodities that we're not specialized in and we do not have any competitive advantage in. So probably, just probably, because the circumstances are not normal circumstances, we need to look at the issue not only from an economic perspective, but also from a political perspective and from a social perspective. We all agreed that it's the quality of life that should be the priority of any policymaker, then it's the sufficiency of necessities and making the main necessities and the basic needs available for every citizen. This is like the real priority. Whether or not this basic necessity is actually something that we have a comparative advantage in, that we are specialized in or not. The priority is to make it available, i.e. to make water available, wheat available, rice available, even if this is going to come on the expense of an opportunity that we could have spent it somewhere else, because we're now looking at a crisis situation and we are now looking for the quality life of the people. And this leads me to another point, another sub-point actually, which is maybe, and just maybe, because we are entering in so many fields and we're touching on so many areas, that we will be actually building areas that we have competitive advantage in, or we get to have a comparative advantage in over time. For example, agriculture and food and the fruits and the vegetables that we are exporting to Europe, something that for political reasons and for reasons justified by quality, we were never able to do in normal circumstances. So this is something that we can build the reputation in, and we can build a quality of delivering and later on having a comparative advantage into. My second point is with regard to the case study, South Korea. I feel it's a little bit unfair to bring South Korea as the example at the moment, not only because it's a little bit far away in time, but because of how South Korea has been seen and theorized in literature. This is not only a developmental state model, it's actually called an authoritarian development. So with authoritarian development and this kind of development where the vision was put only by the president and by the policymakers, and there was no collaboration from the people and from the different stakeholders, and how this vision was implemented and materialized also did not take into consideration the stakeholders and did not take into consideration the different opinions available. Is this how we would like the development and reform in Egypt to happen at the current moment? I feel that the South Korean case is very important. That's very true. And that the vision was really important in driving everything, in moving the ISI, not only focusing on ISI, but an ISI with an eye on the future and having export promotion. So ISI, or import substitution industrialization, is only one step to bring export promotion later on. This is a vision by the president and the vision by the policymaker. And this is really commendable. But is this how we want our vision to happen at the very moment? And this drives us back to the idea of having a coalition of a reform. This is something that did not really happen in the South Korean case as much. Plus, the South Korean case is a very sensitive case. Some literature justifies it and explains it and analyzes it by going back to social capital and how there was a shared social capital between the Shuffles and between the policymakers, and this facilitated so many things together. So it was not only punishment, there was also a shared social capital. Social capital, by the way, was called the magic bullet by the World Bank. It's the connotation of the World Bank as the magic bullet that allowed so many development to occur. So South Korea is a very unique case, but I feel that it's not probably the best scenario that we can bring at the moment. We need a scenario that allows more for anti-poverty measurement, for inequality and anti-inequality measurement, for collaboration between the stakeholders, for coalition in order to bring a vision, and coalition in order to implement that vision. Probably Latin American cases had witnessed some improvement in that regard. So that was another food for thought idea. Thank you so much again. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, for the question. And that makes a difference between when an economist asks a question and a politician asks a question. Okay, so we'll go to Mariam Abdel Karim and then Mariam Ghazi, and then we'll give the floor to Professor Ikram. But please note that we've taken so much of his time. So be quick and to the point, please.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now, right?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Khalid, for this amazing session. It was really insightful. I have two questions, very quick questions. First of all, you have emphasized, and the audience emphasized on the policies that are now being implemented to mitigate the impact of the crisis, and how we will continue to implement such important policies. But I'm more concerned about long-term policies that should help Egypt transition from the survival mode to growth and sustainability mode, because these are very important given the fact that we will need to continue mitigate the impact of the crisis for the short term, but we don't want to neglect this aspect. So I would like to hear your suggestions for such policies. And the second question is related to the fact that I don't see room for Egypt's transition into the global value chain, because there's a general trend towards deglobalization in the world, where countries are becoming more self-sufficient and trying to produce their own products, given the disruptions in the global supply chains. So now that Egypt relies heavily on the imports of intermediate goods in their production of local finished goods, what could be the impact of this in Egypt, and how can we solve this issue in the future? Thank you very much.
Mariam Ghazi, your question, please, quickly, and then we'll give the floor to Professor Ikram, and then we will end the session. We've taken so much out of his time. Okay, Mariam, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ikram, for this talk.
Mariam, please raise your voice.
Is that clear?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Dr. Ikram, you have mentioned that Egypt should not panic about the shortage of food, and we have to support production. I support your words, but I have another opinion. How people can produce with little or a low behavior according to the rules and regulations that Egypt or the policies are putting according to the coronavirus. Yani people or the main problem, the behavior of the people, of the citizens. They're not aware of the safety conditions. They're not aware of the rules. They not have any background of how they protect themselves. Plus, there is a large of number or a large of percentage of poor people that have no access to clean water. So, how these people can interact or how they can survive after or during this time. يعني how policies, how Egypt can solve this problem. يعني Egypt will have a gap of healthcare in this point. That's all I need. يعني
Okay, thank you, Mariam. Okay, thank you, Mariam. Professor Ikram, please, the floor is now yours.
Well, thank you. Let me begin with an apology if I wasn't clear enough. One of the questioners asked that, how can you talk about improving quality of life or so on, when at the moment we're in the middle of a crisis, and one has to think about survival and the basic necessities and so on. I'm sorry if it wasn't clear, because in order to have a better quality of life, you must first have a life. And so, of course, in the middle of the crisis, you have to deal with whatever is absolutely crucial. You have to ensure that people have the basics, and you have to worry about the other things later on. So I was talking about improving the quality of life as one of the fundamental responsibilities of the government in the medium term, after the crisis has been surmounted, after the crisis has passed. During the crisis, government has to do whatever it takes to survive. Because, as I said, you can't have a better quality of life if you don't have a life. So the other question was about, there was one element dealt with the taking the opinion of stakeholders into decision making. And said, was the Korean one sort of a top-down decision? The president and a couple of, not a couple, maybe 20 or so advisors advised, and the president took the decision, and then this was largely enforced on the country. That's true. That was a dictatorship. But I don't know what the situation in Egypt now is. What channels are there for making your voice heard? I'm asking a question because I don't know what for the Koreans. As I said, it seemed to be very clear that you are under threat. The country is under threat from North Korea. The country that supported you, the United States, is in the process of withdrawing its support, or there is a danger that it will withdraw its support. What do you do? So the very existence of the country was at stake as far as the president and his advisors were concerned. And they decided that economic development was the best way of standing on their own feet, not only economically, but also militarily. I don't know what the result would have been if they had issued a referendum or something. But I have been to Korea, I would say, over a 10-year period. I must have been to Korea 50 or 60 times and have a very, very wide range of friends, acquaintances, people I know sort of in Korea. Not one of them has objected to the sort of decision that the President Park Chung-hee took. They objected to some other things that he did. I mean, locking up people and putting them, stifling dissent and so on. And in the end, remember, he got assassinated. His reign ended. Excuse me. His presidency ended when he was assassinated by his CIA chief at a dinner. So I mean, obviously there were people who disagreed with some things that he was doing, and disagreed quite violently with something that he was doing. But it's not clear whether the CIA chief was annoyed that there wasn't more democracy in the country, or he was annoyed that he hadn't been promoted to some other job. I mean, that's never been made clear. Anyway, that's so obviously it's ideal if you build up a large measure of consensus, and there was, and as I said, that the income distribution in Korea during its the period of rapid growth was the second most equal among developing countries. The first was Taiwan. If you go by the Gini indices, Taiwanese Gini index is the most equal for developing countries, and the second most equal during that period of growth was Korea. So whether the president formally consulted the population at large or not, and he didn't, it was obvious that the benefits were percolating through to the population at large, and this is why they were on the whole quite satisfied. Then we had a question about comparative advantage and value chains. And let me sort of step back for a minute and say that whenever I hear that such and such a country does not have a comparative advantage in X, Y, or Z, I feel a little troubled, because you are only talking about a static situation. And if you talked about comparative advantage, I mean, Korea should never have done anything but made human hair wigs and soft toys. It should never have gone into steel manufacture, shipbuilding, automobiles, electronics. I mean, Samsung is the biggest electronics company in the world, and it's Korean. I mean, that the biggest single shipbuilding facility in the world is Hyundai in Busan. It's not the single biggest shipbuilding company, but it has the largest single shipbuilding facility. It's and it would never have gone into those things. So I tend to think of comparative advantage as a changeable thing, as something that's dynamic. You can acquire the tools that change your comparative advantage, and the most important of that, of course, is education. So it is incredible how education-minded the East Asians are, and whether this is probably is a Confucian legacy, I don't know. But it was the first time in my life I saw people's university degrees on their visiting cards, on their business cards. I mean, I'd been brought up in a culture which said that this is crass, this is uncultured to do this. But working on East Asia for the World Bank, I discovered that if I didn't put my degrees on the card, people didn't know how to deal with me. They thought I was illiterate. Korea has, in 1945, remember 1910 to 1945, Korea was ruled by the Japanese. It was a Japanese colony and ruled very, very harshly by them. So the literacy rate in Korea in 1945 was 22%. The literacy rate for Korea around the end of the 1970s or early 80s was 100%. And the emphasis was again on what are now called the STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But and these are the subjects that they look at any of the international examinations. You'll find not just Koreans, but the Taiwanese, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Hong Kong, the Singapore people, and so on, all doing exceptionally well in these subjects. And these are the subjects that a modern economy needs. It's nice if you know Arabic literature. You can read the Alf Laila wa Laila, but I don't think that will earn you a place in the market. So, as I said, you should not talk of Egypt's comparative advantage as if this was God-given and written in the Quran and can never change. You can change it. And to survive, you will have to change it. And to survive and to change it, you will have to move into the STEM subjects. So, sorry, that was my take on. So Egypt can move into whatever value chain it equips itself for. The only thing is that there must be a certain amount of effort and a certain amount of concentration. You can't enter into all the value chains in the world. But you can see that as China moves to more sophisticated products, as Japan has already moved to more sophisticated products, it leaves gaps in the value chain that other countries can move into. And it's very clear now what's happening with the value chains in China. The less sophisticated ones are moving to Vietnam and to Thailand, and some to Malaysia. But the principal beneficiaries are the Vietnamese, the Thais, and the Malaysians. And in all three, what's important is their education systems, which are increasingly science-based or science biased.
Okay. So that answers the questions, right? So, okay. I would like to thank Professor Ikram very, very, very much for a very insightful, informative, and comprehensive discussion. I would also like to thank all my colleagues in the business and the political science department, and of course the economics department. I would like to thank the students. Professor Ikram, thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we did.
I did very much, and I particularly welcome the questions because that stimulates my thinking on a number of topics that I should have paid attention to earlier. I would like to thank all the questioners. They were well thought out, well articulated, and very pointed questions.
Thank you very much, and sorry if we've moved past the time that we've already planned with you, but thank you again for your generosity with your time.
No, not at all. It's a pleasure.
Hope to see you soon. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.